The rain fell over London in a steady, miserable curtain, soaking the tourists who huddled against the railings of Buckingham Palace. For the thousands of visitors pressing their faces to the iron gates, the changing of the guard was the main attraction, a spectacle of crimson tunics, bearskin hats, and precise ceremonial marching. They saw a postcard come to life, a symbol of tradition and pageantry. They did not see John Harris. Standing in his designated box, motionless as a statue, John's eyes moved constantly beneath the brim of his heavy fur cap. While the crowd admired the uniform, his mind was cataloging threats. The man with the backpack who kept checking his watch. The woman with the pram who had been standing in the same spot for 45 minutes. The car with tinted windows that had circled the Victoria Memorial twice. To the casual observer, he was just another guard, a prop in a royal diorama. In reality, he was a predator wearing a costume, a ghost wrapped in scarlet cloth. At 42 years old, John was older than the other guardsmen, most of whom were fresh-faced lads in their early 20s. His face was weathered, bearing the deep lines of harsh sun and freezing wind from a dozen different continents. He had joined the palace guard relatively late, after a career break that his personnel file vaguely attributed to overseas contracting. The young soldiers under his command liked him well enough, but they found him odd. And he was too quiet, too watchful. He never joined them for pints after duty, and he had a habit of materializing behind them without making a sound, making them jump. "All right, Grandpa?" A young guardsman named Private Davies would often joke. "Tell us another story about the good old days." The other lads would snicker. John would just offer a thin, humorless smile and say nothing. They assumed he was a failed regular army soldier who had washed out and ended up in this ceremonial backwater. And they had no idea that John Harris wasn't even his real name. That evening, back in the cramped locker room, the teasing was relentless. The battalion had received notice of the annual regimental shooting competition. It was a prestigious event, a chance for the guardsmen to prove their marksmanship skills. For these young men, it was the highlight of the year. "Davies, you're our best shot," said Corporal Thompson, a burly man with a thick mustache. You'll take first place easily." Davies puffed out his chest. "Too right, Corp. I've been practicing on the range every weekend." His eyes fell on John, who was quietly polishing his boots in the corner. "What about you, Grandpa? Ever held a rifle that wasn't just for show? Fancy your chances, or are you too busy practicing your slow march?" The locker room erupted in laughter. John looked up, his gaze flat and unnervingly calm. It was the same look a wolf gives a yapping terrier. "I'll manage," he said, his voice a low rumble. His lack of a reaction only encouraged them. "Brilliant," Thompson grinned, clapping his hands together. "That's settled then. Harris is entering. This should be hilarious. I want to see how many points you can lose before the bolt gets stuck." They envisioned a comedy of errors. They pictured the old man flinching at the recoil, missing the target entirely, or maybe even dropping the rifle. It was going to be the entertainment of the year. John simply turned back to his boots, his face giving nothing away. He was thinking about a different range, thousands of miles away, where the targets shot back and the wind carried the smell of cordite and dust. He was thinking about a place called the Killing House. The Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst was a world away from the tourist-filled streets of central London. The firing range was a pristine, state-of-the-art facility, and the atmosphere was thick with competition. Officers in crisp uniforms mingled with NCOs, all there to witness the annual marksmanship contest. When the bus from the Palace Guard unit pulled up, and the guardsmen spilled out in their training fatigues, they were met with barely concealed smirks from the other units. The Paras, the Royal Marines, and the infantry regiments saw them as the toy soldiers, all fur and no function. Private Davies was the first to step up for the warm-up rounds. eager to prove that the palace guard was more than just a pretty face. He was a decent shot, and he knew it. He took his position, adjusted his ear protection, and fired at the 300-meter target. The shots were solid, groupings clustered around the 8 and 9 rings. His mates cheered. Corporal Thompson gave him a proud slap on the back. Davies preened, shooting a smug look back at John, who was standing apart from the group, observing the wind direction by watching the mirage on the hot tarmac. The main competition began. One by one, soldiers from various regiments took their turns. Scores were competitive. The Royal Marines, as expected, put on a strong showing, with one of their corporals scoring a near-perfect 98. The paras were right behind them. Davies managed a respectable 92, a personal best that had him beaming with pride. He was currently in 3rd place. Then it was John's turn. "Next up, Guardsman Harris. Palace Guard," the range officer announced. A ripple of quiet amusement went through the crowd. Someone from the Royal Marines contingent muttered, "Hope the target isn't wearing a top hat. He might be too scared to shoot it." John walked forward, his movements economical and fluid. He didn't bounce or jog like the younger men. He simply moved, placing his feet with an almost silent precision. He approached the weapon, an L115A3 long-range sniper rifle that had been set up for the long-range segment of the competition. And it was a formidable piece of kit, capable of incredible accuracy. John picked it up, but he didn't just pick it up. He handled it. To the trained eye, of which there were a few in the crowd, the way he touched the weapon was a revelation. He checked the stock with a caress, feeling for imperfections. He ran his hand along the barrel. He closed his eyes for a second, just feeling the weapon, becoming one with the steel and polymer. He wasn't picking up a tool. He was greeting an old lover. Then he loaded the magazine. The bolt action slid home with a sharp, definitive clack that echoed across the suddenly silent range. The first target popped up at 600 meters. John fired. The shot was so fast it startled the observers. They hadn't even seen him settle into the scope. A second later, the electronic display flashed. 10.600 meters, 800 meters, 1,000 yards. Target after target appeared at impossible distances. John's firing was metronomic. Crack, pause, crack, pause, crack. Each shot was a perfect execution of ballistic science. He was making adjustments for wind and Coriolis effect instinctively, his mind running calculations in the background that would take a computer milliseconds to process. The crowd had fallen into a stunned, reverent silence. Private Davies's smile had frozen on his face, then slowly melted away. Corporal Thompson's jaw was slack. The Royal Marine who had made the joke was now standing rigidly at attention, his face pale. But for the final shot, the range officer called out the ultimate challenge. "Target, 1,500 meters. Moving." A target shaped like a human silhouette began to slide laterally across the far distance. It was a speck, barely visible to the naked eye. This was a shot that separated the merely excellent from the legendary. This was the kind of shot where you had to aim where the target was going to be, not where it was, accounting for the time it took the bullet to travel that vast distance. John exhaled, a long, slow release of air that emptied his lungs completely. In the space between heartbeats, in that moment of perfect stillness, he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was deafening. They waited. 2 seconds. 3. The sound of the bullet striking the target was inaudible, but the visual was not. The silhouette, which was the size of a postage stamp at that range, jerked and folded backward as if punched by an invisible god. A perfect score, a clean sweep. Now the silence that followed was so profound you could hear the shell casing rolling in a slow circle on the concrete floor. John stood up, his face betraying no emotion. He hadn't done it for the applause. He had done it because that was what he was built to do. As he walked back to his stunned unit, he passed Private Davies. "Sometimes, John said, his voice low enough for only Davies to hear. "The old ways are the best." It was then that a high-ranking officer from the SAS selection board, who had been observing from a viewing gallery, lowered his binoculars and whispered to his adjutant, "Get me that man's file. The real one." The confrontation came not with a bang, but with a quiet knock on the door of the small flat John rented outside London. He opened it to find Brigadier General Alistair Finch, a man whose face John knew well from a dozen classified briefing documents. Behind him stood two younger men in plain clothes, their posture giving away their military bearing instantly. "John," the brigadier said, not asking to come in, "we need to talk." John stepped aside, his face unreadable. He had been expecting this, or something like it, ever since the competition. He led them to his sparse living room. There were no photographs on the walls, no medals on display, just books on ballistics, topography, and military history. "Quite the performance at Sandhurst," Finch began, accepting a seat. "This a perfect score at 1,500 meters on a moving target. That's not a skill you pick up on a weekend training course." "I've had practice," John replied evenly. "We know," Finch said, his voice hardening slightly. He placed a manila folder on the coffee table. It was stamped with red letters. "Top secret / eyes only." "We know about Hereford. We know about the 22nd SAS Regiment. We know about your hiatus. And we know about Marja." At the mention of that name, Marja, a flicker of something dark passed through John's eyes. It was a hell of a lot hotter there, and the targets didn't slide on wires. They were men with guns who wanted to kill him and his mates. Finch continued, "The reason we're here, John, isn't to drag you back into the sandbox. It's the opposite. There's a new threat matrix. We're losing too many good men to IEDs and ambushes in urban environments. The next generation of snipers needs to learn from the best. They need to learn from you." They wanted him to train, not just any soldiers, but the elite. The new blood of the SASR, the guys who would be dropped into the deep, dark places John had spent 20 years navigating. They were offering him a position at the sniper cell at the Special Forces Training Center. John was silent for a long time. He looked at his hands that had saved lives and taken them, and hands that had held his dying friends. The uniform of a palace guard hung in his closet. It had been his sanctuary, his penance, his attempt to disappear into a world of simple order and routine. "Why me?" John finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I was done. I was invisible." The brigadier leaned forward. "Because, John, the men who are dying out there aren't invisible. They're brave, they're strong, but they don't know how to wait for 3 days without moving. Oh, they don't know how to read the terrain like a book. They don't know the dark art of the shot like you do. That young lad Davies, the one who laughed at you, his brother was killed by a sniper in Helmand last year. We can't let that keep happening. We need you to build us an army of ghosts." The words hung in the air. John thought of Davies, with his youthful arrogance and his complete ignorance of the real world. He thought of the look on the boy's face when that last target had fallen. He thought of a dusty street, a flash, and a friend's blood on his face. The palace guard was a costume. This was his skin. "When do I start?" John asked. The transition from the silent, solitary sentry of Buckingham Palace to the screaming chaos of the SAS training grounds was a shock to the system that John had not anticipated. The Special Forces Training Center in the Welsh Mountains was a place of perpetual damp, cold, and exhaustion. It was a pressure cooker designed to crack the weak and forge the strong. John stood before a class of 12 candidates. They were the best of the best, already hardened soldiers from the Parachute Regiment, the Royal Marines, and line infantry units. They had survived the infamous selection course, the hills, the interrogations, the sleep deprivation. Now they were in the continuation phase, learning their specialism, and they were not happy about their new instructor. Sergeant Major John Harris stood before them in simple camo fatigues. He wasn't a mountain of muscle. He was lean, almost wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved from old wood. His eyes, however, were what held them. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the abyss and had stared back. "Gentlemen," John began, his voice carrying easily in the cold air, "you've learned how to run, how to shoot, how to navigate. You think you're hard. You're not. You're children who've been playing with toys in the sandbox. Today, the real lesson begins." The main lesson was patience. For their first exercise, John marched them to a muddy, freezing cold hillside overlooking a valley. He pointed to a small rocky outcrop about 800 meters away. "Your target is that rock," he said. "Specifically, the small lichen patch on its left side. You will observe it. You will not fire. You will not move from this spot until I return." He left them there, up for 6 hours. In a freezing rain that soaked through their expensive Gore-Tex jackets and turned their bones to ice. The candidates fidgeted, cursed, and shivered. They didn't understand. One of them, a hot-headed Marine named Corrigan, finally stood up. "This is bollocks!" he shouted. "We're not learning anything, we're just getting wet!" A rifle shot cracked the air. A bullet whizzed past Corrigan's ear, close enough to part his hair. He dropped to the mud, screaming, and the other candidates hit the deck, scrambling for cover, hearts pounding in terror. From behind them, John emerged from a hide he had constructed so perfectly that he had been lying 10 meters from them the entire time. He walked over to the prone, shaking Corrigan. He held up his rifle. "That," John said, his voice ice cold, "was a blank. But you didn't know that, did you? You stood up. You made yourself a target. You got your entire squad killed because you were a little bit wet and a little bit bored." He addressed the whole class. "The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, they don't have a time limit. They will wait for a week, in the hot sun or the freezing cold, for you to make one stupid mistake. They will watch you through their sights while you eat your rations, while you take a piss, while you complain about being bored. Patience isn't just a virtue in this job. Yeah, it's the difference between going home to your wife and being shipped home in a bag." From that day on, the dynamic changed. They still didn't like him, but they began to respect him. He taught them how to build hides so effective they could lie in the open and be invisible. He taught them how to read mirage and wind patterns by feeling the skin on their necks. He taught them ballistics at a level that was almost mathematical poetry. But most of all, Tiki taught them about the mind, the psychological fortress a sniper must build to survive the isolation and the horror of their work. One evening, around a small stove in the training area, one of the candidates finally asked the question that had been burning in their minds. "Sergeant Major, why the palace guard? Why the fur hat and the tourists after all this?" John looked into the small blue flame. He could have given them a dozen answers. Instead, he gave them the truth. Because, he said softly, when you've spent 20 years in the dark, sometimes you just need to stand still in the light for a while. You need to remember what it is you're actually protecting. It's not politicians, or oil fields, or strategic interests. It's that. The history, the people, the idea of a place where a kid can make fun of an old soldier and not be afraid that a bullet will take his head off. The candidates said nothing. For the first time, they saw the man behind the myth. Then the final phase of the training was a live exercise, the culmination of months of brutal instruction. It was a simulated hostage rescue scenario in a derelict urban training village. The terrorists were played by veteran instructors, and the hostage was a mannequin. The candidates, now designated as sniper teams, were tasked with eliminating the threats and clearing the building. The exercise was designed to be chaotic, confusing, and incredibly difficult. But for the 6 teams of 2, it was their chance to prove they had learned the lessons of the Ghost of the Palace Guard. John positioned himself in a high tower overlooking the village. He watched through his spotting scope as his students put his teachings into action. He saw them move with a patience that wasn't there months ago. He saw them scanning, observing, communicating in whispers. He saw them become part of the environment. The primary team, led by the once arrogant Corrigan, crawled into a position that offered a view of the main entrance. It took them 2 hours to move 400 meters. They lay in a ditch filled with stagnant water, not moving, not swatting the insects that crawled over their faces. They waited. Inside the building, the exercise controllers threw everything they had at the candidates. Flares, smoke, loudspeakers blaring terrifying sounds. But the sniper teams held. They breathed. They waited for the shot. Finally, the moment came. A terrorist appeared in a window, exposing himself for just a fraction of a second. From the ditch, Corrigan fired. The simulation tag hit the target perfectly. The shot was the signal. The assault teams breached the building, their movements precise and violent, a direct result of the overwatch and security the snipers provided. It was a flawless execution. Back at the debriefing hall, the atmosphere was jubilant. The candidates were hugging each other, slapping backs, the adrenaline still pumping. They had done it. They had passed. John stood at the front of the room, waiting. As the noise died down, he walked to the podium. He looked at their young, proud faces. 12 soldiers, ready to be deployed, ready to take their place in the secret wars. "You did well today," he said. The room swelled with pride. "But listen to me, and listen carefully. This is not an ending, it is a beginning. The real test starts now, out there in the black stuff. You will see things that will haunt you. You will make choices that no man should have to make. And when that happens, when you are alone in the dark, cold and scared and questioning everything, remember this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. From it, he produced a single brass button. It was the button from a palace guard tunic. He held it up. "I carried this with me through deserts and mountains, through firefights and funerals. It reminded me of a quiet garden, of a life worth protecting, of the reason we do this. Find your own button, gentlemen. Find your own reason. It's the only thing that will keep you sane." For the first time, the room saw John Harris smile. It was a small, sad smile, but it was real. John Harris did not attend the graduation ceremony. He didn't like crowds. Instead, he stood alone on a hill overlooking the base, watching the young men in their dress uniforms shake hands with the generals. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. His work here was done. He had built them an army of ghosts. A few days later, John submitted his resignation. The brigadier tried to convince him to stay, offering him a permanent commission, a higher rank, anything he wanted. John politely refused. "The shadows are getting a bit too crowded for me, sir," he said. "Time to find some new light." He didn't return to the palace guard. That chapter was closed. Instead, he took a small cottage in the Scottish Highlands, miles from the nearest neighbor. He lived a simple life. He tended a small garden. He read books. He walked the hills in all weather, a solitary figure against the vast landscape. Sometimes hikers would pass him on the trails. They would see an older man, fit but unremarkable, with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. They would nod and pass by, the unaware that they had just shared a path with a man who could have ended their life from a mile away before they even heard the shot. One afternoon, a young man appeared at his cottage door. It was Private Davies, the young guardsman who had once mocked him. He was no longer a private. He wore the uniform of a captain, and on his shoulder was the winged dagger patch of the Special Air Service. "Sergeant Major," Davies said, standing to attention. I don't know if you remember me." John nodded. "I remember you, son. Tea?" They sat on the small porch, looking out over the valley. Davies explained that he had followed John's path. After the humiliation at the shooting range, he had done some digging, made some inquiries, and learned the truth about the quiet guard. It had changed his life. He had applied for SAS selection, driven by a need to understand, to prove himself. He had made it through on his second attempt. I just wanted to thank you, sir," Davies said, his voice thick with emotion. "That day at the range, you destroyed me, but you also built me. Every time I wanted to quit, in the hills, in the interrogation, I thought of you standing there, so calm, so still. I thought, if he can do what he did, and then stand in a box and be mocked by idiots like me, then I can carry this pack one more mile." John looked at the young man, this officer, this killer in the making. He saw the ghosts of his past and the hope of the future. "Remember what I told your class, Davies," John said softly. "Find your button." Davies reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished brass button. "I did, sir. I went back to the palace guard quartermaster, bought it off him for a tenner." For the second time in his life, John Harris laughed. A real laugh, one that echoed off the hills. The young captain smiled, stood up, saluted, and walked away down the path. John watched him go, a lone figure heading back into the world. He looked out at the wild, beautiful, peaceful landscape. He had spent his life learning to see the enemy in the shadows. Now all he saw was the light, and for the first time in 40 years, he was finally home. The ghost had found his peace, had